When Star Trek Infinite was first announced, I was excited about the idea of using a game like Stellaris as a base to build different mechanics used in different universes and periods off of. After all, we do something similar with the Empire at War expanded mods, and really modders everywhere do it with any mod that converts a game like Stellaris to a different setting. But especially when it comes to a game people have to buy instead of a free download, the key point is going to be in the execution, and whether or not being a real licensed project opens doors that are usually closed to modders. And believe me, there's usually more closed doors in modding than a place with a lot of actual closed doors. Unfortunately, so far, my experience with Star Trek Infinite didn't show many of these doors being opened. Really, even if it turned out to be not super fleshed out at first compared to the massive swath of content you can often find in mods, if there were some extra polish and streamlining of that content, I would have been pretty satisfied. The game didn't really meet that bar though. In overall presentation, I do think the game does a good job. In this playthrough as the Federation, I liked the changes made to the UI, and I thought the overall UI style there worked pretty well. Early on, there's some interesting choices and events that you get thanks to the game's focus on a more narrative experience than Stellaris can often offer. The caveat for this part is I wouldn't really describe myself as a Star Trek fan, so just how much this reflects the lore, I don't really know. Regardless, I found this phase of the game pretty enjoyable despite some clear bugs. Some event, I'm not sure which, had the wrong audio cue, so the game was telling me about heroes dying regularly, as if it's some sort of ghost of Empire at War campaigns past, haunting me for my sins in an entirely different game. What this cue was actually supposed to signify, I still have no idea. But the more I went through my campaign, the more I found different parts of the game which don't really work with how they're converted. As the Federation, you're not able to claim territory, so wars in order to expand really aren't going to do you much good unless that can come through the establishment and dissolution of neutral zones, which I didn't play around with much other than the one you start with. Your expansion will typically come from convincing everyone you're really nice and worth working for, and then integrating the smaller civs found throughout the preset map. And you're able to even win the game by getting to 12 different civics in your faction, which you acquire through that integration. I decided I wanted to be friends with as many of the major powers as possible as well, meaning the Cardassians, the Klingons, and the Romulans as the other three playable factions. Despite my close relationship with the Klingon and Romulans, they didn't feel the same way about each other, and I soon found myself in a defensive war on the side of the Romulans against the Klingon. Combat is pretty much identical to Stellaris on the battle side and the war side for better or worse, but while I still had fun with the game up through this war, I really started to see the problems of the game after this point. Despite the new mission tree you have, going down different narrative paths for different bonuses, there didn't seem to be enough thought into whether and how a lot of these mechanics would actually work in-game. One of the mission lines you have as the Federation follows some of what I think is the plot of Deep Space Nine, and requires you to have Bajor in the Federation. I didn't really notice this until later, but I'd apparently been locked out of actually accessing this, and I was locked out pretty early on. Because there's not really a simple way to take territory that already belongs to the other factions when you're playing as the Federation, after the Cardassians integrate Bajor themselves, it kind of just becomes irrelevant. In a defensive war, you can apparently claim the systems from Cardassia and anyone else, but by the later phase of the game where this mission starts coming in, you're not likely to be able to make the AI declare war on you. You're probably going to be a lot more powerful than them. You can try to act really fast early on and either fight a war to liberate them while they're a subject before they're integrated by Cardassia, or if you get really friendly with Cardassia, I think you can demand that they be released. But if you're like me and you're exploring the game as these things come up and you don't know too much about the setting beforehand, you're not really going to know that this is a thing you have to do and that there's no alternative later on. And really, now that I think about it, even if you are familiar with the setting, I don't think it's very obvious in that situation that there's not much you can do about it later on. I've spent a fair bit of time looking up various threads on the internet on how to proceed with the mission chain, and everything I've seen has tended to involve bending over backwards to exploit edge cases, like disarming all your ships and tricking the Cardassians into declaring a war on you, so you can make claims while in the defensive war, rather than working more organically within how the game's designed. There's so many places where this game seems to be fighting its own design. Aside from not being able to get Bajor from Cardassia, as the game went on, I found myself not really interacting with the other major factions at all. Once I was strong enough, I was never going to be threatened by the Klingons or the Cardassians, so there wasn't much point in interacting with them since I couldn't do anything to them either. And even the Romulans, whom I'd failed to save from the event destroying their homeworld, thanks to having been unable to do other missions as far as I can tell, there didn't really seem to be much I could do with them despite us legally having been declared besties for life. As a result, I did nothing with the Romulans other than get annoyed at them for being useless in our war with the Klingons, nothing with the Cardassians except declare a war to humiliate them because I was getting kind of bored and didn't know if that would help with me freeing Bajor, and then nothing with the Klingons after our war in defense of the Romulans. Not to worry, I naively thought, at least I'm still working towards defending against a big Borg endgame crisis. After all, this mechanic works perfectly for the Borg in Stellaris already, with the Borg invasion event starting to pop up, a bunch of mentions of them on the mission tree, and my slow but inexorable expansion and domination of the galaxy as even the other major powers started to show as pitiful next to the Federation's might. It seemed like there was still a big fight ahead of me. But then once I failed to beat the pretty large stacks in one of the middle events in the chain, which had I already been able to beat, it would have meant the other empires were even more irrelevant than they already had been for a while, everything seemed to just stop. That Borg fleet remained at the wormhole until I returned to mop them up, but the follow-up I was waiting for afterwards never seemed to arrive. The rest of the mission tree makes it seem like there's other stuff that's supposed to happen, but while failing that one battle seems to have luckily been the one neat trick the Borg don't want you to know about, reading other people's experiences with the game don't seem to indicate that there's all that much more to it even if you do win there. Certainly not something resembling the endgame crises from Stellaris that I was expecting. So from there, while I was waiting for more of the smaller factions to like me enough to integrate while still thinking I was preparing for a big Borg invasion, I started pursuing the other mission paths that were available, primarily being confused about the Bajoran one, and also trying to upgrade the Enterprise. The Enterprise mission tree is a neat idea where every different type of mission is done and gets you a new crew member, which is either a unique admiral or other hero for your faction, or it's an upgrade to the Enterprise's capabilities itself. With the Enterprise being a kind of hero fleet which can also do some surveying and serve as a science ship, which I think is a neat idea. One of these missions, though, the last one which I needed, required fulfilling 3 diplomatic missions, which you use to make those smaller factions like you more, and then you can integrate them from there. So it's a pretty key mechanic behind how the Federation plays, which itself seems to be the faction with the most attention in the game. These missions, with or without the Enterprise's involvement, are probably something you're going to interact with a lot on your way to the 12 civic point victory condition. Half of the missions I wasn't able to do with the Enterprise at all because they required either a construction ship or just pressing a different button, which is fair enough, but the other half that involved sending a ship to actually execute them showed another place where the changes they'd made between Stellaris and Infinite just weren't well thought out. You see, the game takes a different approach to interstellar travel than Stellaris does, at least in modern Stellaris where there's only one type of travel between stars. In Infinite, you can either follow highway nodes or you can go within a certain range of your own territory. In some ways this allows for more free movement, but for a lot of the missions you do for smaller factions, you're told to go to a specific place in space, either in their territory or just outside it. The problem here is even when you border them, you can't always get to the areas in or beyond their territory to fulfill the mission. So more often than not, I'd ask for a mission, they wouldn't let me through their territory, and then I'd fail the mission and lose half the work I did improving my relationship with them. It turned out to be far, far easier and less risky to just build up my economy and just send gift after gift of energy credits until they liked me enough to want to join the Federation. I'm not saying I wouldn't join the Federation for the right price, but I didn't find it the most interactive way to win the game. But with enough credits on the table, join they did, and I won the game with a big chunk of the Alpha and Beta quadrants under my control, no sign of the Borg, and half my mission tree not just unfinished, but soft-locked away from my access. I really wanted to like this game, and I still think there's potential for the concept. A lot of what works about Stellaris still works here, but at this point it would be very difficult for me to recommend Infinite over playing a mod for regular Stellaris, despite the weird flaws you can often find in mods. Realistically, if a mod had been released for Stellaris with this level of flaws, I'd probably find that acceptable, but again, mods are free. This game was not. If games are able to recover from rough launches with proper support, which is not just paid DLC but free fixes and updates, I'm personally not one to hold that against them, so I'm going to revisit the game in a few months as probably a different faction to see where it stands, but for now I'm probably unfortunately going to have to boldly go play something else.